want to get started. And I'm Brad Eggleston. I'm Palo Alto's Director of Public Works. And I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening for the presentation by Dr. Christina Hill, Planning for Rising Waters, Sea Level, Groundwater, and the Bay's Edge. Now this event is sponsored by Save Palo Alto's Groundwater and the City of Palo Alto. And we'd like to thank Save Palo Alto's Groundwater for their leadership initiative in organizing this event. We're very excited to be holding it. I'd also like to thank the other main event sponsors who were shown on a slide, but I can read some of them off. Sierra Club Loma Prieta Chapter, the Peninsula Interfaith Climate Action, Palo Altans for Sensible Zoning, Ferguson Garber Young Architects, Tuolumne River Trust, and Palo Alto Neighborhoods. And have some applause. So why is Palo Alto and Save Palo Alto's Groundwater organizing an event like this? As part of Palo Alto's Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, the city recently adopted a sea level rise policy, and right now we're beginning our work on a sea level rise adaptation plan that'll be in the works over really about the next 2 years before we complete that. And obviously, understanding sea level rise impacts on groundwater is a significant component of what we as a Bayside community in Palo Alto need to be studying as we plan adaptation strategies for the future. And I really have to say I'm thrilled to see such a response from the community tonight that I heard we had close to 300 RSVPs and we've almost filled this community center room, so this is great. So I thought it'd be useful to just take a few moments to get a sense of the people in the room. So if I mention part of a group that you're part of it, you could just raise your hand and we could get a sense for who we are here in the group together. So how many of you are Palo Alto residents? Okay, I think the great majority. How many of you are professionals who are working on sea level rise or groundwater? So some of those as well. And how many of you are academics studying sea level rise or adaptation to sea level rise? So a few of those, but a much smaller group. So also before we get started, I'd like to recognize some of our elected officials and their representatives and former elected officials that we have here with us this evening. So Senator Jerry Hill's district representative, Lisa Chung, is here. If you could just stand for a moment, Lisa. Thank you. Leslie Bullock, Assemblymember Mark Berman, senior field representative, I believe, is with us. We have Lydia Koo, Palo Alto council member. I haven't seen her here yet. She might not have quite arrived. And we also have council member Allison Cormack in the audience. There's Allison. I wanted to recognize also a few former City of Palo Alto officials. So Dina Mosser, who's a former mayor, is here. Peter Dreckmeyer, former mayor, in the back. Pat Burt, former mayor. And Greg Schmidt, a former vice mayor. Then also wanted to mention that we have Sally Lieber is signed up to be here this evening, who's a former California State Assembly member and City of Mountain View mayor. Okay, so thank all of you for coming. So now that I've got to recognize some of the luminaries that are in the audience, I'll do something that's a little more like what public works directors typically do, and that's direct your attention to the emergency exits and locations of restrooms. So as you'll see, emergency exits in all four corners. If you're not familiar with this facility, restrooms are out this door and kind of around the corner. And one other thing I'd like to mention, Rita Varel, one of the members of Save Palo Alto's Groundwater. In the back there, if you've enjoyed the refreshments that were provided today, She was in charge of that and personally cooked and baked many of the items, so I hand for her. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith Bennett from Save Palo Alto's Groundwater, who will introduce Dr. Hill.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for coming. When we put this event together, we had no idea whether we'd get 10 people or 300, so we got the largest room the city would let us use very kindly, and this room holds about 300, and it's pretty nearly full. So we're very thankful that everyone came. Save Palo Alto's Groundwater is a grassroots organization advocating for the protection and wise use of our community's groundwater and adopting well-thought-out underground construction planning and zoning practices to ensure that the impacts from cumulative underground construction do not increase Palo Alto's risk of flooding as sea level and ground level rise occur. We are very appreciative of Dr. Hill's willingness to present to the city, and we're also extremely appreciative of the support that the city provided in making this space available, and Brad and Julie coming from the city to this event and helping us organize it. Just so people think the city isn't squandering money, all the food was paid for by private donations, so there's no city money involved in the refreshments. We will have time for questions after Dr. Hill's presentation. And you'll notice cards on your chairs and some pens are scattered around. So if you have questions during the talk, you can note them down on the card. And there will also be, there's a microphone in the center aisle. And then we'll have volunteers that are going up and down to pick up the cards. So you can either line up at the microphone or fill out a card and hand it down, and we'll try to get your questions answered. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Christina Hill is an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, which incidentally is my hometown. Professor Hill studies urban ecology and hydrology as a way to understand both strategies and limits for adapting to climate change. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, she became a member of the Dutch-American engineering and design teams that developed the water management strategy for New Orleans. She continues to collaborate internationally to understand the potential for designs to help protect coastal communities as sea levels rise. Her work on groundwater led to her collaboration with the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the City of New York on strategies for assessing future groundwater flooding problems in coastal areas. She lectures internationally, and apparently across the bay as well, on adaptation to climate-related flooding, and is writing a book on the subject. With her PhD from Harvard University, she has been a member of the faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of Washington in Seattle, and the University of Virginia before coming to California. She was honored as a fellow of the Urban Design Institute in New York and has conducted research in Stockholm, Sweden as a Fulbright scholar. So with that, I will turn over the microphone to Professor Hill.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people come out and talk about this totally geeky subject. And can everybody hear me okay? How's the mic? Okay. I may stick with this mic because the lapel mics sometimes make a lot of noise for people like who wander around like I do, so I'm going to try to keep this simple. Let me pull up my slides. Hopefully that will happen. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about how groundwater and sea level are related first, because that's been a big surprise for a lot of us in adaptation planning. And I like this photograph, which I stole from Flickr, because it shows both the sea and the groundwater. And the groundwater is that stuff you find at the beach when you dig down in the sand. That's often fresh water moving its way towards the sea. So this photograph includes both and makes it really clear that those two things are close to each other and related. So first I want to start by talking about the 2018 state guidance on sea level rise, so that we're all talking about some of the same numbers for how much sea level rise we might be expecting. The state looked at different projections, and before I show their numbers, I want to show this mapping tool in relation to Palo Alto, because this mapping tool shows, in this particular version, only 50 centimeters, or about 1.5 feet, of sea level rise, and here's Highway 1. This is the, 101, sorry, 101. You can tell I'm from the other side. This viewer is called Our Coast, Our Future, and let me tell you, as a person from Boston, that is really hard to say, and that is so unfair that they named it that, because I want to pronounce that Our Coast, Our Future. So here's 101. Here's all those wetlands you all have, and then here's this section near the bay, which has a whole bunch of creeks that bring water down to it and is very well connected to this tidal area by the bay. This next image shows 1 meter. I just wanted to give you a sense before I show you the numbers the state is talking about how much area might be affected. So this is 1 meter, and here we are. So beachfront property, that'll be a nice addition to the recreational facilities. And this is that same 1 meter, but this time with an annual storm scenario, storm surge in the bay. The biggest storm that we would see that raises the level of the bay, and here we are again. So it's spreading out sideways, and it's just creeping up a little bit up the hill. And now we're still at only 1 meter. The state's sea level rise guidance was a long process of working with scientists all over the country. It was a really interesting group that they brought together, and they developed a set of probabilistic models that revealed, they thought, what was the most extreme and unlikely, they call the H++ scenario, what's the sort of medium risk, the middle way, and then what's the low risk. And the way that they're thinking about risk is in terms of, if you have a project that you're planning like a park, and it's not going to be a very expensive park, then you might take these assumptions about sea level rise. If you're planning something that's supposed to last for 50 years, then you might want to take the middle road and use these assumptions, this assumption. And if you're planning something that's meant to be permanent or that you'll have to be paying for more than the 30 or 40 years, you might want to take the high road, the H++ extreme scenario. And I just put onto that graph what 1 meter is. So we looked at those maps of Palo Alto in relation to 1 meter of sea level rise, and that could be, in an extreme scenario, that could be 2054, medium high risk 2068, and the low risk version already out to somewhere around 2100. So I think of these, I explain to my students, these are like 3 roller coasters. And we've bought a ticket, but we don't know to which one. We definitely have the ticket, and we are getting on. We just don't know if we're on the super scary, the medium scary, or the somewhat less scary. And then I also like to point out that after 2100, this is not a magical year when the problem goes away. After 2100, this is a curve, so all of these lines get steeper after 2100. So we'd better have a plan that's going to work multiple generations into this adaptation process. But we have to start it with us. I think that's only fair, given how big our carbon footprint is as individuals compared to what our children and grandchildren's carbon footprints will have to be. So these are the state's numbers, not my numbers, and I think it's useful to consider whether, when we think about a district of a city like Palo Alto, is that a low-risk situation where it's no big deal if it gets flooded? Is that a medium-risk situation where over 30 or 40 years we might let it go? Or is that a situation where we really should be looking at the high-risk H++ scenario? And I think most property owners would think that's a high-risk H++ scenario category when you're talking about a district of a city. We can talk more about that. That's a controversial topic. So this is from Rotterdam's Water Plan 2.0, which they finished in 2009. New Orleans is on its Water Plan 1.0, which was finished in 2013, so no one is keeping up with the Dutch at this point. And what they point out is, even in 2009, they were telling their people, yes, it's sea level rise, yes, it's extreme rain, yes, it's river flooding coming from upstream. Their river comes from the Czech Republic, And it's also groundwater being pushed up by that sea level. So I just point that out because they've been working on this for a while. Now, their groundwater, they set laws about what depth it should be. They have such an extensive network of pumps, you know, all those windmills. They've had an extensive network of pumps for a long time, so I think of their groundwater as domesticated, and I describe ours as wild, undomesticated. We really don't know where it is, what quality it has. This shallow urban groundwater is what I'm talking about, not agricultural irrigation groundwater. We know more about that. So just so we're all on the same page, groundwater is the water from the rain that's stored in the soil. And imagine a magnified version of all these little pieces of soil with pore space, the saturated zone, that's the groundwater. That's the shallowest version of groundwater. It's not necessarily an aquifer, it's just all these pore spaces filled with water, and the top of it is called the water table. And I'm going to use those terms kind of interchangeably when I say the surface of the groundwater or when I say the water table, I'm talking about the same thing. This is how the USGS represents that. This is the sea in this diagram, and you can see the water table slopes towards the sea, and it presses up towards the sea and actually discharges. So freshwater discharges at the ocean edge. And salt water, which is denser, also presses against the fresh water, and there's a transition zone which is a little bit brackish, but they don't mix that easily because they have different densities. So as the salt water rises, that's more pressure coming from this side, and it should be pushing this fresh water up. And that's how it's always worked. It's just that we haven't seen this process for about 10,000 years. So the first study of this was done in New Haven, Connecticut by the U.S. Geological Survey around 2009 or 10. They collected the data, and then 2012 they published the report. This is the city of New Haven with Yale University, that other university that we don't talk about. And the results showed that a rise in sea level, now they modeled this. They used very complex models to show this, but they modeled it and showed that the sea level was rising, and then they were able to see an effect at 17 to 24 feet above sea level. So it's groundwater rising not just right at the ocean, but 17 to 24 feet above mean sea level, according to their models. I'll show you the map. This is a map that showed if the sea level rose 3 feet, about a meter, these contour lines show how much above the existing level the surface of that groundwater would rise to. So the surface of the groundwater down here is a little under 3 higher, 2.5 feet higher, 2 feet higher, 1.5, 1. But this is now, here's a mile. So this is now 3 miles in, and they're still seeing an effect on the height of the water table. That's what they mean by it going up significantly higher. And then this one shows these contour lines all bunched up here, and that means that it's even steeper. So this whole area now has a higher water table. This side considered both sea level rise and more intense rainfall, because of course that's the source of groundwater. So they modeled both of them. So it showed back then there was going to be an impact, but this USGS project report kind of dropped into the sea and nobody paid any attention to it, except one guy out at the University of Hawaii, a man named Chip Fletcher, who's a professor of geology out there, and he started looking at Honolulu. This is the Alawai Canal, if anybody has been to Honolulu. Beautiful place. They looked at the same kind of idea. They said, well, within about a mile of the ocean, we think the groundwater will rise pretty much 1 to 1. So 1 foot of sea level rise would produce 1 foot of groundwater rise. And that's idealized. We don't know that it'll really do that. But based on that New Haven study, we think it's possible. And it depends on your geology. So I'm going to go back here. It depends on your geology because they have volcanic rock that sets them up for a certain kind of groundwater dynamic. We have alluvium and bay mud. But what they showed that was making everyone hard to sleep at night was here's the 1 meter map of flooding in Honolulu. All this blue, here's the Alawai Canal. All this blue is flooded with 1 meter of sea level rise. And all this blue is flooded if you add groundwater to the flooding. Emergent groundwater. This is not groundwater within a foot of the surface. This is groundwater above or at the surface. 50% more flooding. So that's pretty amazing, and they've planned a whole light rail system for this part of Honolulu, so that's going to be interesting to see what happens. So that really was the wake-up call when people saw it in map form and realized how much more flooding could be related to groundwater. And then we started looking in the Bay Area, and I knew people were interested in this at public agencies, but I couldn't get anybody to pay me to do this. So I paid a very smart graduate student to make a map, and we tried to find a data source that would allow us to do it quickly and easily. But before I show you the map, I want to show you, I think I can with this clicker, what does it look like when you see groundwater? This is a video somebody made and posted to Twitter. This little manhole is in Alameda, right near the Bay Farm Island golf course and the edge of the bay. So this is a sunny day, and at high tide, it's a king tide, the water is starting to bubble up out of the manhole. No big deal, right? This is total nerd territory here. That's it. But that's the beginning of water that will eventually flood this street and start to flood the properties around it. That's how it starts. It starts with something small like that. And then you see the street flooding as that water table continues to rise. So I'm just showing you we're on the way. We can already see it starting to happen. So here's Palo Alto. This is a data set that the State Water Board maintains for the whole Bay Area, and it's wells that have been used to monitor mostly contaminated soil sites. Every time there's a leaky underground storage tank or a dry cleaner that polluted the soil, they put in these wells and they monitor around that site for a period of time. And we used that data set because it has about 1,200 wells in it for the whole Bay Area to interpolate a surface, which means, here's a cross-section now, here's the land surface. We took the maximum elevation of the water table in all 1,200 wells, and we generated an interpolated surface. This is the quick and dirty way to get a groundwater map. We interpolated a surface, we looked at different interpolation methods, we chose the best fit, and we didn't extend it more than, I think it's 1/4 mile beyond any well. So we have a lot of data gaps, but we have more data in the urban areas, which is where we wanted it, because these wells are used to monitor polluted soil. It's not process-based like the New Haven study, but it shows all these places where empirically, in all these red and orange areas, the water table is very shallow already, at its maximum. So it's a worst case. It's a wet year. Maybe there was a high tide when they went and did the sample. They do these samplings maximum quarterly, so it's not sampled frequently during one season. But it shows empirically where the water table is already high. And that has value in and of itself, even though it doesn't show other things we'd like to know about how the groundwater is changing over the seasons. So here's Palo Alto. I'm going to zoom into this, but I just wanted to show you the colors first. The red is 0 to 1 meters below the surface, and then 1 to 2 is orange, and 2 to 3 is yellow. So the groundwater is coming down the hill. We have a band that we're looking at, which is, as I said, 1/4 mile from all of our wells, and within 1 kilometer of the bay edge. So about 1/2 mile from the bay edge. And as we looked at these maps, we realized we probably need to expand that because we're cutting off a very shallow groundwater zone there. So here's, sorry this map doesn't show the streets underneath with the projector, but I'm glad I have the labels at least. So here's Embarcadero and Oregon Expressway, Middlefield Road. We're somewhere, I guess, down here. And you can see that it's fairly shallow and that it's related to something. That's what I like about the empirical data. It's related to the roads in some way, or to what people are doing with their properties. And when you see a high stretch of it along these roadways, something is going on there. And it could be that the compacted roadbed is actually blocking the water from moving as easily as it should. It could be, as my friends at Save Palo Alto's Groundwater thought maybe it was, maybe there are a line of basements that have been built there. I don't know. But what I like about these data is it's showing us something that's a fact instead of a modeled projection. So as sea level rises, these areas will all, this groundwater will get shallower, and these red areas at 1 meter of sea level rise will all be emergent as ponds. So that's the big takeaway. This map, again, is that map of 1 meter of sea level rise with no flooding in this case, and here we are. And you can see that the areas, whoops, it's a similar area. This area shown with very shallow groundwater, and this area shown with sea level rise. And what's important about that is, I'm going to use these sections to try to explain, they're likely to do something about sea level rise adaptation with 101. On the East Bay side, they'll do something with 880. We're going to use roads, very, very important roads, as sort of control lines for what's going to happen in relation to sea level rise. Some of these roads will be raised. Some of these roads will be put in tunnels. And some of them will be raised on bridges, and some of them will be raised on compacted earth. But the strategy that's chosen for protecting the road is going to determine what happens on the inside. But no matter what we do, what I imagine is, let's say that they raise this highway on an earthen berm, which is the cheapest way to raise it, and that's what everyone will go to first. They'll have to let the creeks out, so there'll be tide gates wherever there's a creek. And at some point, the tide gates are closed all the time because there's no low enough bay water. There's no point where the bay is low enough to let the creek water out the gate. Then the gate is shut all the time, and you have to build a pump station that's big enough to pump all that creek water out over the road. And that's what New Orleans does. They have university campus-sized pump stations that do that pumping over their boundary wall, their levees. So that's what we get into, and maybe this section will help visualize that. There's our saltwater saturated zone coming from the bay. Imagine a levee with a road on top, or not here. Stormwater channels or creek channels that are currently used to convey surface water away. Underground sewer pipes, basements of houses, and contaminated soil that's probably capped from above, because that's what we did in the 80s and 90s. We capped it from above so that the water wouldn't come through it and spread it around. We didn't line it from below. And as that seawater zone rises, even with a levee, all this groundwater is going to back up. The freshwater groundwater is going to back up on the backside because it can't get out as fast. So we'll see this groundwater rise. It will saturate and then eventually be expressed in surface channels that are used right now for conveying rainwater. So there won't be any place to put that rainwater. It'll fill sewer pipes, so there won't be any place to put, if you have a combined system, the stormwater plus the human waste that currently goes down those pipes. So they'll be full before the waste ever gets to them from an individual sewer lateral. Basements will be affected. Foundations will start to heave because of that hydrostatic pressure from the water, and the polluted soil could be remobilized and affect people in new ways. So those are very, very important impacts of a rising water table. And even if the engineers design a very expensive levee that prevents some of that water from seeping, you're still going to have too much on this side because it can't flow out at some point. So that's a little hard to visualize, but I'm hoping that this makes that point, and I'm happy to answer questions about it afterwards. So now we come to the very special part of living in the Bay Area, which the Dutch know beans about, let me tell you. They don't know anything about earthquakes. They don't know anything about biodiversity. So how does this affect us? We all know we have all these faults. We talk a lot about the Hayward Fault now because that one's super likely to be active, and that could affect the peninsula side of the bay as well as the East Bay side when it does go. In Christchurch, New Zealand, this is what it looked like when soil that is similar to the kinds of soil we have around the bay edge had the earthquake energy wave go through it. This is liquefaction. At the moment, the 60 seconds or minute and 20 seconds, whatever it was, when the earthquake happened, this soil behaved like a liquid, and this car dropped in. And then as soon as the energy wave was passed, it re-solidified, and they had to dig that car out. Luckily, there was nobody in it. This is a parked car. Or maybe the person got out. I suppose there's a reason why the door is open. But that's what it looked like, and this is what it looked like on streets when liquefaction happens. You have a liquefaction zone. The USGS made a map in 2006, and it shows this big red zone that goes pretty much under Highway 101. Here we are again at the community center here, down along San Francisco Creek, out along by the golf course there. And as the water table rises, that is one of the major predictors of a liquefaction zone. It's the texture of the soil and the elevation of the water table. So as that water table rises, we'll see an expansion of these liquefaction zones. I think about that a lot because my house is right on the edge of one, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be affected. So let's get to some good news. How have cities adapted to to groundwater and sea level rise in the past? But especially high groundwater. The poster child for how to live well with a high water table is Amsterdam. The canals, this is the original part of Amsterdam here, the downtown with the railway station and some of the museums. These original canals were built close together because when they built these canals, they dug down into the wetland soils and they piled it up on the land between the canals. So they balanced their cut and fill locally as they did this, and they introduced some pumping at the ends of the canals to create some positive pressure and flow in the canal. And that basically wicked moisture out of the blocks between the canals. So the early canals are close together. And as they develop more powerful pumps, the next generation of canals in the 19th century are farther apart. So you can see the windmill era canals and then the other, I'm not sure what the energy was, probably coal in the 19th century, pumping that had more energy and was used to build those canals. But they developed a way to live in a beautiful way with this high water table, where there's room for bikes, cars, pedestrians, boats, and this is a wide canal. We don't have to have canals that would be that wide, but we do need to think about how we create space for that groundwater to move away. So one pretty obvious strategy is to use canals. And that's a strategy that might be used in existing neighborhoods to protect existing buildings for as long as possible. Not piling up the dirt onto the block, but cutting away and using that dirt potentially to create levees or to create habitat if it's clean. And finding ways to create a zone here where we can do all the things we want to. It would be smaller because our right-of-way isn't that large. Here's an image of an animation that my students made to show people what happens when you add a higher groundwater, you add water to a groundwater system, and you have a canal. So watch this side. This is the water table rising. They're pouring water in the same amount on both sides. This one has no canal, just a street. They show that this very deep basement they've built in the model starts to flood on both sides. And then this side starts to stabilize because the canal discharges water, in their case through a hole in their plexiglass, not with a pump. And they keep pouring the same amount of water into both sides, and this side keeps rising and eventually floods the street. And this side doesn't. So we're making a lot of these little physical models to help people understand what we're really talking about here, basic physical principles that we may be able to use as we think about adaptation that could be beautiful. I don't want to be a Pollyanna about this, but could be beautiful at the same time we're dealing with some of these challenges. The Dutch are also taking on a new approach in a district outside Amsterdam. It's part of the city of Amsterdam, but it's called the Waterbert or Steiger Island. It's on the IJsselmeer, this big lake that exists next to Amsterdam, and the neighborhood's also called Eiberg, lots of names. And they are doing floating prefabricated housing on ponds where these are artificially bounded. This big bar building is on a conventional foundation. These are on conventional foundations, these stacked prefabricated units. The piers are fixed, they're on pilings, but all these units are floating, and in fact, they're floating on the first story. They look like this in the evening. This is a room that you can use as a bedroom, and it's also your pontoon. It's all prefabricated and sealed. People have boats at their houses. It's not a bad way to live. And this is actually the lower-end version of it. They've done now a very high-end version of it with a lot of exposed wood, which is expensive to maintain. This is mostly metal, metal and glass. But what occurred to us when we were looking at these images, this is another image of that same development, the ducks and people's little boats here. What occurred to us is that this could have some benefits for us in terms of seismic preparedness also, because there's no tsunami in these little ponds, and you're isolated, your building is actually isolated from the energy wave by floating. It's like the ultimate base isolation, but cheaper. So we looked at this in a design competition. I'll kind of go quickly through these and come back to Palo Alto. This is East Oakland, around the stadium, A's Stadium and the Oracle Stadium. This is Bay Farm Island and the city of Alameda over here, the airport. You can see the airport's in trouble. This is the water table, so it's also very shallow in this area. It's an old wetland that was filled. So a lot of our, we call them ghost tidelands. They're coming back to haunt us. These are all the contaminated sites in the industrial legacy of East Oakland, a lot of them, and they're likely to have some remobilization problems and health exposures. So the idea was, dig hole, make mound. This is the central tenet of landscape architecture, an idea that was put out by a man named Richard Haig in Seattle in the 1980s. I've just saved you a graduate degree in landscape architecture. That's it. Dig hole, make mound. Balance your cut and fill locally with whatever you do. Don't truck in thousands or millions of cubic yards of material. So the idea is make an artificial pond, use the material to build some pieces of a levee, build habitat on that levee, and float housing in the pond to pay for it, which is another Dutch innovation. They've been digging artificial ponds and putting houses for wealthy people in those ponds, which pays back the public investment in the landform infrastructure. And then the pond holds not just groundwater, but stormwater from the area around it. So the pond is like a piece of their stormwater infrastructure, and then they have rich people live in it to benefit other people living around them. This is, I think, a fantastic idea. Everyone gets what they want. And if you have, educated people who have expectations living in these houses, it is the ultimate monitoring system. Because who's going to call the city when something goes wrong? These people are going to call the city when something goes wrong. So who needs fancy drones to fly over and measure the performance of the dikes? This was the basic idea, was that where creeks come down to the bay and the water table is high and the sea level is rising, we could propose a kind of honeycomb of artificial ponds where floodwaters from the creek can move into those ponds temporarily, raise the level a little bit. It's all okay because these units are floating. The ocean can rise up to a certain point, and all of it would be relatively stable. It just needs tide gates to allow water in and out. So we developed that idea into, a more formal drawing that shows an artificial pond and floating units like the Dutch, and then some conventional foundation units off to the side. Those conventional units or buildings would have to actually be quite a bit taller to pay for the extra deep and numerous piles that would be needed to support that with a higher water table and rising sea levels. So it's not quite realistic there, but this part I think is reasonable. And then we developed some drawings of what that might be like, how it would have to be like a kidney that lets water in and lets water out through tide gates. Let me show you a version of how this works with the rising water. Here are these floating units on shared decking in a pond with a tributary coming by, and then this might be a major road, and then the ocean's out here, the bay. So this is now mean tide, a little wetter, king tide, wetter, and the landforms have to be robust so that they're still doing all the work they need to do at that king tide level, but everybody's still floating and happy. Then you get to 10 feet, which would be a king tide with 3 feet of sea level rise, and you can see the landforms are starting to look a little precarious. So we'd have to think about how long we could do this for, but we think we could get to between 4 and 6 feet of sea level rise with these kinds of artificial ponds and floating units on shared decking. And then the idea would be to relocate those modular units and the modular decking to a new pond and fill the old one. So it's like rolling up the rug as we leave, reworking the soil like earthworms, cleaning up all the mess, and retreating in an orderly way. That's really managed retreat, where you clean the soil as you go back. Because if we don't clean that soil, then all that contamination goes straight to the bay and gets spread by all the currents and organisms in the nearshore environment. So let me end on a little bit of governance and policy and then open up for questions. These are things that, this is, I hope, a takeaway from what I've just talked about, that if someone says to you, we're just going to use levees or seawalls and we're going to fix this problem, now you know that is not going to fix the problem. You're going to have flooding anyway. It's just not going to be salt water. It's going to be fresh water. And we didn't realize that as recently as 10 years ago. We need to update building codes to think about foundations and how they're going to perform under these high groundwater conditions. It's more pressure. So we better look at our foundations and see what's going to happen. We have to find a way to innovate in these high groundwater zones, because otherwise we have to pay to clean them as we retreat, and there's no new money coming in. So it would all be public money from some jurisdictional level that would have to be used to clean it up as we leave. So I think it's better to attract private money and, in a way, build our way out. Build a little more as we move from the flooded zones back over time, multiple generations. There are some opportunities in weird California law. And maybe you've heard of the Geologic Hazard Abatement District. That's one of my favorites, because even though some of my ecology colleagues describe that as, they don't pronounce it, I pronounce it GAD, G-H-A-D. I just say GAD. That's what most people say. But the ecology crowd says jihad, because they don't like it. They think it's being used in places like Malibu Beach and other places to develop in areas of sensitive habitat and justify staying too long in a dynamic environment with sand dunes and potential wetland habitat. So we have different perspectives on this. But what's cool about it is you can form a sort of special district, but it has no sunset date. This is a special district, unlike the Belarus districts, that can charge its members fees to do things to improve safety in relation to soil movement. It's been designed for use in the hills where landslides are the problem and homeowners need to do all kinds of crazy stuff to keep their houses on the hill. But it can be used in soil liquefaction zones, which is also a soil velocity problem, and also in dunes, which probably isn't as good an idea. But it allows you to actually be exempt from CEQA. And anybody who's a planner in the room, let me repeat that. People in the back, if you're doing a GAD, you're exempt from CEQA. I'm not supposed to say that. The attorneys who do these GADs don't want anybody to promote that idea because they think that it'll eventually cause them to be taken away, the option to be taken away. But it would let people in districts that are going to be affected by flooding act to protect themselves, just like people in the hills act to protect themselves from landslides. And they'd have to pay for it themselves, but they might also find state money or other sources available to them, depending on people's income levels and the value of the landscape for other reasons. Insurance partners. I just had in my class these two young and very earnest men from Berkshire Hathaway Specialty Insurance, who refer to Warren Buffett by first name. Warren. They say Warren believes this. And what they told me about Warren is that Warren has started this insurance company because he has so much capital that they can have an insurance company that doesn't have to use reinsurance. So you don't have to go to Switzerland or Munich and ask their insurance policies to be reinsured by some huge entity like Swiss Re or Munich Re. So they can set their own policies for who they insure and who they don't insure. And I don't know if anybody in the room is aware of this, but they are talking to people about insuring properties in Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, instead of FEMA or the National Flood Insurance Program. So this might be an alternative on the private market to going through the National Flood Insurance Program. And what Berkshire Hathaway thinks is what's their business model is they want to know more about your flood risk than you do, and they want to be right. So they can insure the properties that people are nervous are vulnerable, but are really not that vulnerable. So that's how they're going to make money at this. And I think that if we do something unconventional like floating urban districts, we could talk to the Berkshire Hathaway people, and as long as they go to the Netherlands and see that things actually do float there, I think they'll be confident things will float here, and we'll have a partner, because FEMA right now will not insure floating houses. So we need a different partner, somebody who can take capital risks, and if Warren can't, no one can. And then I think there are going to be new incentives for how we do our adaptation, and this whole issue of potential remobilization of contaminants is a really big new incentive. If you live in a place where it's possible that volatile organic chemicals are going to start moving in the direction of your sewer pipe or your basement, that is a really big deal. A lot of those chemicals have a volatile component, a gas component, and that can penetrate your basement or your crawl space without the stuff or the water ever having to come in. So that's a really important dynamic to be aware of, and many of the big Superfund cancer studies have been related to vapor penetration. So we have to start thinking again about vapor penetration. And you know, it's sort of a geeky topic, but it's really life and death for a lot of people, and something we need to be aware of and start tracking again. So I've tried to light a fire under the Water Board and Cal EPA, and I think people are starting to move in this direction of reconsidering how to pay attention to those issues, and maybe that'll motivate some earlier adaptation before we actually see floodwater emerging at the surface. So I think that that's, local versus regional perspectives. Now I'm talking about the Water Board and the EPA. There are people who are saying that we need a regional adaptation plan before we do local adaptation plans, but I think it actually would make sense for communities of more educated people with more resources to start talking about this early. I'm looking at you. Berkeley, Sausalito, San Rafael, all of us, well, Palo Alto and San Rafael are going to be affected very early. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to adapt and give the state some good ideas, or give BCDC some good ideas, not wait until there's a big regional plan that may not be sensitive to local conditions, like groundwater depth, or even exposure to remobilized soil contaminants. So I'd like to see local start first, and then start teaching regional, and then regional can incorporate the best ideas. That's my perspective on it. I'm not big on regional government because I think there's so much to learn locally, and we're really pretty dumb at this point. We need to learn a lot to be able to do this right. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Professor Hill, for an enlightening talk. We now have time for about 30 minutes, actually a little bit more, about 40 minutes for questions and answers. We have until 8:30, and we can do it, we're doing it two ways. One is at the microphone there, and just be sure you turn the microphone on when you have the questions, or if you have questions that you'd just like to write on a card, Ron, raise your hand. Ron and Greg are walking around, and they'll pick up the cards, and then we'll try to organize. And Esther, are you picking up cards too? And Esther back there on the outside edge, pick up cards, and then we'll give them to Julie over here to sort and ask questions. And you're free to ask a Professor Hill question, and we have some representatives of the city here as well. So if you are wondering what the city is thinking about or what questions the city has, I think you're free to ask. So with that, we'll take a few questions from the mics while we're collecting cards, and then we'll go to the cards, and then we'll go back and forth. Okay, Arthur.
Thank you. I'm Arthur Keller. I'm actually Vice Chair of the Environmental and Water Resources Committee for the Santa Clara Valley Water District. And one of the things about that is that there's a consideration sometime in the next several years to replace the current safe and clean water parcel tax that's on there. So there's an opportunity to think about what we might want in that tax in the next go-round. So the question I want to deal with is that right now where we are, we're in the confluence between Adobe Creek and Matadero and Barron Creek, and they come together right near 101. And right near in around there is East Meadow Circle, which is currently undeveloped, not very developed piece of land, which was recently largely bought by Google, not all of it, but they bought a lot of it. So what I'm wondering is that an interesting place in the confluence between two creeks in a controlled area to basically do some experimentation in conjunction with thinking about also what goes along the bayfront and such, to try to experiment with some of these ideas so that we can see how well they might work locally in working with Google in terms of development of that area.
That would be a great location to try that. That's what I thought when I looked at the map of Palo Alto, that those creeks coming together right there on the land side of the highway, that's a place where there's going to be a lot of flooding risk. So why not use that place to test this idea, excavate to the water table, and then everyone can learn. And I think this is going to be a beautiful way to live. So I can't see that it's not going to make money, as long as we can figure out a permitting path, and that's far enough from the bay edge that it should be relatively permittable.
And one of the things about it is currently the FEMA rules say that if you're in a flood zone, you have to sort of jack yourself up. And so that's one of the things that is at risk for people who actually live in the flood zone currently, is that if they have, say, fire damage or earthquake damage, they have to rebuild their house from scratch.
Yeah, and it's very hard to jack your house up in an earthquake zone because it's expensive.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, my name's Bill Straka, and over time I've wandered around various parts of the world, and I have a question that relates to one area which this seems to be similar to, and that is Venice. If you go to Venice and notice that you have water flowing into the town during time, and then it gets out. There are similarities in what you have up here. And so I'm wondering have people started learning, or hopefully more than started learning, from Venice and looking at what it does? And I've looked at the Netherlands as well. So there's more than one place where this sort of thing is going on, and have people more broadly looking around everywhere.
And I agree, Venice is a really interesting case. Is anyone here from the Venice government? Okay. Venice is not an example of doing things in a really orderly way. Venice is an example of learning to live with stuff. And there is beauty in learning to live with stuff. So they also have a really nice color water, which we will not have. And their barrier is really a question, whether their barrier is going to work that they've designed. So I think that we can learn a lot from all of these cities. Venice is a great example of floodable development. And that's what we have to learn to build. Development that tolerates flooding and actually benefits, celebrates, makes that an aesthetic advantage, or at least something people can learn from. So people have learned a lot by living in Venice.
And my boss said he was next to a pool and half the water jumped out of the pool. So I have these horrible visions of, the water not being stable. Did you run any simulations, or have you done any testing to ensure that if there was, let's say, a 7.0 on the Hayward Fault, that these houses wouldn't have damage?
I don't know if the houses would be damaged by a 7.0 in the Hayward Fault, but I know about 100,000 other houses that'll be damaged by the 7.0 on the Hayward Fault.
I mean, does the water provide a stable or an unstable base for
I
those
haven't
houses?
done the simulation. So I think that it's reasonable to say it's possible that your friend exaggerated how much water came out of the pool. And I think it's reasonable to say that we'd have to be careful because the landforms that hold this together, they're really the skeleton. And if that soil is unstable, then the water would run out. So we'd have to figure out, is there a risk of that? If the houses just beach on their pontoons, no big deal. Broken dishes. But if they actually tip over, that would be a problem. So that's what I like about the shared decking. It's more like a snowshoe, and you've got blocks on top of a snowshoe. It's less likely to tip over than the Dutch model, where it's 3-story pastries that could easily tip over if they beach.
I think the seismic stability of the water would be a great graduate student project.
It would be.
Hi, Mark Rooston with the battery company too. What do you think of viaducts or bridges and podiums made with ultra-high performance concrete as well as houseboats and relying heavily on elevated group and personal rapid transit to make a network of people being able to move around?
Well, you'll be surprised to know that I worked on personal rapid transit in Seattle 10 years ago. I was briefly the head of a public agency. It was a terrifying period of my life. It was totally an accident. Other people resigned suddenly in one weekend, and I became the head of a public agency with a $2 billion budget that was supposed to extend the monorail in Seattle, so I looked a lot at public rapid transit. I think that the automated vehicles are going to be our public rapid transit at some point, that we'll have fleets of those that function like the vision of the PRT
Yeah, but the
system.
elevator can be cheap with the structures and stuff I'm talking about, and I got a friend who has the tooling for the coaches in a warehouse.
I think it's exciting, and I also think it's exciting that we may see prefab housing made by people like Google to disrupt the rental markets around here. So who knows what technology will come up that people try to use who are very heavily capitalized to change the way we move around and the way we live. I think it's going to be interesting.
What do you think is going to happen to the airports around the Bay Area in the next 50 years?
That's a really good question. Anybody here from the airport? I know this is going to go online, so I'm going to hear about this anyway. The airports right now are planning levees as a way to protect the runways. The problem with that is it's like walking the plank. You can only raise the levees so high before the planes can't land. And it's really not that high. So it's maybe 4 feet, maybe 6 feet, not really. And some of that has to be what's called freeboard. It has to be extra height. So they might get to 3 feet of sea level rise with a levee strategy. I don't even think they'll get that high because they're already pumping at airports like Oakland, and the pumping is going to accelerate subsidence. That pumping is a problem. So they're going to be sinking at the same time they've built these levees. And I think we're going to end up with airport problems and have to dedicate the whole airport site to the high parts of it, to runways, take the terminal and put it someplace else, take a train from the terminal to the runway, the gate, and eventually we'll have to float our runways. The Japanese have already done it. It was called Mega Float. You can look it up online. It worked in 2004.
Hi, my name's Mike. You just said something about the pumping would cause the runway to subside. Don't they slow down when it starts to subside? Can't they control how much they pump and keep the balance?
They
That
can.
wasn't why I came up here.
They can, except that their water table is still rising. So with a rising water table,
It from not rising, from
they
rising.
could try to get it exactly right so that they're only pumping within a certain level and they never pump the wetland soils. But most American agencies are not that good at that. We overshoot and then we correct and then we overshoot and then we correct. We just don't do that much monitoring.
That's
So
not
it's a
what-
very delicate problem.
But I came here to ask. If I wanted to start with a comment about Sausalito. I've spent a bit of time there. They know all about floating housing in Sausalito. There are lots and lots of houseboats, and they're all out there nice and happy. At any rate, I had a question about New Haven.
Yeah.
All right, how did they test New Haven? Did the seawater rise? Did the sea level rise? And they took measurements?
They didn't test it. I may have been a little misleading when I was describing it. They modeled it. They simulated sea level rise.
All right, that's all I wanted to know. Oh, and the blue zone around Palo Alto, the light blue, is that places where groundwater will rise, or will
The
the high
blue
tide
is
will
salt
come?
water, and then the red and orange yellow map I was showing is the groundwater, the fresh water.
They had the big baby blue zone that came.
Yeah,
somewhere
that's
near.
the seawater.
So the seawater will come in that far?
Yeah.
At 1 meter, okay.
Yeah.
So we'll see the tide come up these creeks.
Yeah, they're not going to
Yeah,
let that happen. They're going to plug those holes under Highway 101.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Great. We'll come right back to you.
Okay, so I'll read a few of these. If a shallow well near the bay doesn't show tidal influence, would that indicate that area is not prone to groundwater flooding or emergence?
That's a really good question. We are trying to figure out this thing called tidal efficiency. How much does the pressure of the tide affect the level of the water table? And that's a way to talk about the early impacts on groundwater. So if it's not rising and falling with the tide in a well, that's a good sign that it's probably not going to be affected early by the rising seas, but it doesn't mean that it won't accumulate behind some levee or raised road or compaction in a roadbed. So you could still see flooding in that location because of uphill sources of groundwater, even if it's not being pushed up every day by the tides.
And a two-part question here. The city of Alameda just declared a climate emergency. What does this mean?
The city of Berkeley's declared a climate emergency. I think it means no more plastic straws. I can't tell what that means. I'm in a group that's supposed to be helping the city of Berkeley, and the city of Alameda hired consultants to help them. I think it's so hard to talk about that we have to start talking a little more realistically about a 10 or 20 or 30-year adaptation period, because no one wants sudden change. They feel like it's too soon, that we don't see the sea level rising yet, so why should we spend $1 billion bond on something that's not, it's not happening yet? So I think it's difficult to talk about, even though we've declared the emergency. I hope that means mitigation. I hope what that means is everyone's supposed to be on a bike or in an EV or on a scooter. But all I can see so far is the plastic straw thing, so I don't know.
The Resilient by Design project looks amazing for all 9 Bay counties. Will this likely be funded?
Yeah, I think you have to raise the...
Oh, I'm sorry. The Resilient by Design project looks amazing for all 9 Bay counties. Will this likely be funded?
No. I think that only a few projects are going to get any funding at all, and the best hope for the one that we worked on in East Oakland is maybe that the A's will take some of our ideas in developing the Coliseum site, which is a very problematic site. It's going to flood, it's polluted. And maybe that the state will give cap and trade funds to East Oakland to build some canals or test other ways of lowering their groundwater, because it's a very low-income, disadvantaged community. They may get funding from the state's Strategic Growth Council. So that's possible. And some things are going ahead. Islayas Creek in San Francisco is going ahead. And there are a couple other small things. There's a wetland being built near the Oakland airport, but it feels very much like tinkering around the edges and not something bold.
Here's one about green stormwater infrastructure. How can green stormwater infrastructure be used to ameliorate the groundwater sea level rise challenges?
Well, the green infrastructure that we're looking at for sea level rise is really our coastal wetlands. That was Measure AA that some of us voted for, and that is meant to reduce wave energy. So it's a way of buying time as the sea level rises to reduce the wave energy using the wetland so that the waves don't get into more people's properties. But over time, those wetlands have to either go up or in, or they won't be there anymore. So we have to think about what's going to happen with those wetlands. And stormwater infrastructure, this is a very interesting challenge, because if we're talking about the city as a sponge and trying to get more rainwater into the soil, when the water table comes up high, there's no room in the sponge. So we'll have to look at these groundwater maps and start thinking about maybe it's during the dry season we can do that. But then you don't need to put stormwater in the ground during the dry season. So we have to look at the zones of the city and think about what we can do in different zones. There's a lot of use for green infrastructure, just not where the soil is full of water. Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment first and have you react to it. I think you haven't emphasized the urgency of this. I've had a professor at Stanford, a good friend of mine who was in the climate change business, He says we're too late already in some ways, and with the Antarctica ice is failing, and a lot of Greenland's ice failing, we're going to go up faster than we think in sea level rise. And so I'm wondering, we ought to pressure people that we have to move faster.
Yeah, that's a really painful conversation, and I've had it a lot. And I think the state is right to push the 10-foot sea level rise as an important adaptation goal, because it's possible. And when new data come out about the rate of melting in Greenland or Antarctica, we're twinned with Antarctica. As it melts, our sea level rise in California is going to go up more. That's our sister city, is the West Antarctic ice shelf. So we need to pay attention to what's happening. Some people think we've already committed to 10 feet of sea level rise based on how much CO2 is in the atmosphere now. So I think it's possible we could get beyond 10 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And that's a terrifying roller coaster to talk about. It's usually a conversation stopper. But, you know, after we've had this little chat, we can go on to the next little chat about what we'll do as this goes faster. And it's important to remember, these are the last stable decades, what we're in right now. These are the last stable decades of what's maybe an 8 to 10,000 year stable period in which we've developed cities and culture as we know it. After these last stable decades, things will start to change faster and faster. We'll all be like, oh my God, no one told us this was going to happen. But here we are talking about it. We know it's going to happen. It's an exponential curve. It's slow at first, and then it accelerates. So how will we cope with that? I don't think human brains are very good at getting it.
As one other thing, I heard you worked a little bit in New York. I wondered how New York is going to solve the problem of another Sandy with the subways flooding and all that in the southern part of New York.
They have a very interesting team that goes down to the subway when a flood is predicted and pulls out all the electrical stuff. That's what they do. So they're doing it by operational strategies right now, and they will eventually develop tide gates. They're using these self-raising gates in New York now, and as water enters a tank underground, the gate rises with no mechanical parts. Just it rises and falls based on the water pressure. So we'll see if those work. That's what the Dutch use.
So I'm a local resident, and I'm worried that I'm taking the wrong message from your lecture, so I'm here to get a little correction.
Thank you for checking.
So there has been a longstanding discussion in the city about more control over groundwater pumping on new construction. What I get from your talk is we want to reduce groundwater levels. So why should we bother to block groundwater pumping on new construction? What am I missing?
As the groundwater level comes up, it's more volume and more pressure, more hydrostatic pressure. So I'm just kind of cartooning the future of this. It's possible that people who've done deeper basements may cause water to pond uphill of them, that it may not make it through that sort of semi-barrier of large basements. So we could see neighbors be flooded by water that should be flowing to the bay and isn't. And what we need to think about is, where is that groundwater, this wild groundwater that we're only beginning to get a sense of? What is its quality, and where do we need to pump? Where would it be safe to pump without causing subsidence? If we can find those places, we can pull some groundwater out. Or we can do canals with pumping to pull some groundwater out. But to do it without planning seems like it's more likely to result, to intervene in the flow of the water table, because it is always moving. To intervene in that flow without knowing what we're doing seems more likely to cause more problems. So,
Let me do a quick follow-up.
yeah.
So the discussion here, as I understand it in the city, is not dealing with the impact on neighbors of deeper basements. It's dealing with, we don't like to see all this groundwater pumped down into the sewers. We want to restrict that. So that's not what you're responding to.
The state is pushing all communities to think about reuse of groundwater, especially in an earthquake if we lose our water supply or for non-potable uses. So there's a pressure happening all around the state to think about how to use that groundwater wisely and not waste it, not mix it with salt. So that may be a concern in and of itself. But as the water table rises, there'll be other concerns about water quality and about emergent flooding and about the impact on pipes. So it's a kind of complicated answer to your question, but basically we need to know a lot more about it, this wild underground thing.
So let's say that 101 or 880 become barriers and can hold water back, for some amount of time. What about water treatment plants and sewage treatment plants that tend to be on the other side of those freeways?
Yeah, that's a multi-billion-dollar problem, isn't it?
Because we could all move uphill, right? In theory, we can't. But let's just say we all move uphill. If our water is coming from downhill, way downhill, sea level, then we have a bigger, a big problem.
Well, and that's where Santa Clara's water purification facility, that's water coming from downhill, right? And then being pumped back. I don't know how high people are going to pump it, but sewage should all just be gravity flow until you get to having to move it over something, and then of course it's got pumping associated with it. I'm worried about how waterproofed our sewage plants can really become and how waterproofed our pipes can be. Because the higher the water table, the more water in the pipe is not the kind of water we need to treat. So it's using capacity that we don't want to give up. So I think that there's a lot of waterproofing. If I were anybody in the room who knows a company that does waterproofing, invest in that company. Or pumps, because we'll be using both those things to try to protect our coastal infrastructure like water treatment plants and sewage plants. So there's a paper out about it by a student who used our groundwater models. I'd be happy, if you want to leave your name on a card, I'd be happy to send it to you. But it's, every time we double down on spending money on a sewage treatment facility or something else that's floodable, we're committing debt to a project that may not function 20 years from now. So we have to start looking at that debt period for our public investments in relation to the life cycle of the asset. And sewage treatment plants are a really good example. My colleague at Cal, David Sedlak, is advocating for us to move away from centralized sewage treatment and to move the sewage treatment to small plants up on the hill. So we may actually move the sewage treatment, break it up into smaller, what's called package plants. That may be part of the solution. But then somebody has to decide, in what year do we pull the plug and stop investing in that multi-billion-dollar facility?
And who wants a sewage treatment plant in their backyard? That'd be hard to get approved, too. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
If I heard you right, did you say San Rafael and Palo Alto are going to be impacted quicker and sooner?
That map I showed of how much flooding could move underneath 101 with 1 meter or even 50 centimeters of sea level rise, that's an early impact. Central Bay cities are higher up. They're not going to be as affected as early. San Rafael gets hit with also 50 centimeters or 20 centimeters of sea level rise, so just like that much. So San Rafael and Palo Alto, also East Palo Alto, Foster City, those places are on the front line. And Mission Bay is at least 4 feet, 5 feet up, and they've been piling up dirt to raise themselves, and that's what developers want to do. They want to make a big pile of dirt to build houses on. And it's not a great idea. It's what Brooklyn Basin did also in Oakland. And we'll see a lot more people try to pile up dirt to say, no, we're safe, we're high. But of course their pipes are underground and they'll have lots of other kinds of problems.
A few more questions from the audience here. Which Bay Area communities are best prepared to adapt to their risk of sea level rise and which need the most assistance? How could this inequity be effectively addressed?
The communities that are disadvantaged and are in line to receive some state adaptation funding are not well organized enough to make good use of that funding. The communities that are really well organized are not likely to receive a lot of outside funding. So it's going to be the community that figures out how to bring private capital in that moves first. And maybe that's a really well-organized community like a Palo Alto. It has to be a community that provides political support to their elected officials and their department heads to do that. If it's a city where the populace isn't as active, then people will be afraid to make decisions that seem too aggressive or controversial in some way. Berkeley doesn't have that much of a flooding risk, otherwise maybe that climate emergency would turn into some kind of adaptation work. So I hope that Palo Alto is going to be different in the way it looks at this problem. Foster City wants to raise its levies. It's kind of doing the old thing that it's done before. San Rafael doesn't seem as ready to act. For some reason, staff or elected officials or the general population isn't as engaged. It's mostly lower-income people who are the most exposed. So I don't know who's going to go first, but I hope that Palo Alto might decide to lead on this and make some really beautiful, exciting experiments that put you on the map as a tech and adaptation capital. But of course, it'll be a Berkeley idea, not a Stanford idea. So I don't know if that'll fly.
As a Cal alumni, I'll ask the next question. How does Venice differ from Amsterdam? It's not working in Venice.
Well, the Dutch collect a lot of data, and I think that empirical approach has really helped them. And I think the Italian approach has been a little bit more roll with it. You know, let's celebrate, let's roll with it. They just abandoned floors of those palazzi, those amazing historic buildings that they have in Venice. They just abandoned floors. And their water is pretty polluted with sewage. Anybody who's been there knows that smell is not, it's not people walking their dogs. So they have tolerated a different environmental quality. And the Dutch expect everything to be clean and orderly. And they collect a lot of data. So I think it's the cultures that are as different as the conditions.
Last, San Mateo County is launching a sea level rise and flood agency. What do you think is the best channel for implementation for here?
Well, I think that working with private developers is the best way to do something cool early. I know that Len Matterman from the San Francisco Creek JPA, the Joint Powers Authority, is working on the Safer Bay Levee, and I think that's interesting and probably appropriate, but there'll be questions about whether the wetlands can survive on the outside of that levee, what will happen when sea level starts to drown those wetlands. Once you make a decision to build a levee, there can be some path dependency. You get stuck just raising your levee, like Foster City. So I hope people will think about what to do on the land side of the levee that's creative, and maybe the levee will never have to be as high as what sea level rise might, require if you did a conventional levee. If you can have floodable development on the land side of your levee, the levee doesn't have to be as robust, because the development on the land side tolerates flooding. So that's what I hope people will try, and I think the peninsula is the right place to try this stuff, because you have people who imagine different worlds. I think they would be interested in investing in this kind of stuff.
Hi, great talk. There's a bill moving through Sacramento that will override existing community zoning and allow building, 4- and 5-story apartment houses without necessarily even parking near transit hubs. And many of those transit hubs are between 101 and El Camino. Does this make sense to be building 4- and 5-story apartment buildings in a potential flood and liquefaction zone at this point? Or is that sort of planning for 100 years where we don't even have maybe 10 or 15?
Over the last 10 years, I've heard a lot of people pit the sort of housing crisis against the need to plan for sea level rise. And I think that by doing something that's technically innovative, like floating structures, we can do both. And there's a limit to how many stories you can float, but 3 or 4 stories you can float. So maybe we need to look at testing what the local control will be over the kinds of foundations that those buildings have that are justified by engineering reports on groundwater and seismic risk. So maybe a local ordinance could require those new SB 50 buildings to have floating foundations. I would try the technical argument about the kind of foundation, not whether or not there should be housing, but the kind of foundation that housing should have, and then I think that'd be a fascinating court case. That'd be worth talking about, because that could determine the future, what kinds of structures we make. I know everybody's under non-disclosure agreements to talk about the Apple headquarters building, but I have heard that there's a section of that building that has a floating foundation. So I don't think that it isn't being done. I think big buildings are having to deal with some high groundwater already, and we just need our consulting community to start talking about it and help us think about what local ordinances could force innovation. I'm pro-housing, but I think that we need to do it with a kind of foundation that's sustainable. On what subject? I don't think that Facebook has made any plans for the future sustainability of their site. And my understanding from talking to consultants who've worked with them is that they don't see it as a pressing issue, and I think that what that means is that they would consider relocating. And these aren't water-dependent industries, so there's no reason why they can't relocate.
Hi, my name's Joe, and on the red, orange, and yellow data for the groundwater levels, how was that data captured? Was that taken with like a piezometer or something like that, or?
No, that's an interpolation. It's just an mathematically interpolated surface from those 1,200 waterboard well data points.
Okay.
So it's from points to surface.
Are there any like technologies for more accurately reading groundwater levels?
Yeah, you use piezometers, a version of a piezometer in a well to get real-time data on the level of the water in that well. And that's how we would measure tidal efficiency. So I hope that communities like Palo Alto that are going to be doing more work to plan for adaptation might contract with people who will do that. And then we'll learn more about how our alluvium behaves around here, which we have very similar alluvium across the bay.
So in Palo Alto, when they build a basement, there's two ways to do it. They could broad area dewater and recapture and reuse that water, or they could put in a secant wall and cut off the water. And the secant walls go down about 40 feet, whereas a basement goes down 15 feet. So these secant walls are basically permanent structures that'll go in the ground, and after 10 of these a season, after 10 years, you have 100 of these in the ground.
Yeah.
Would that be a major issue for groundwater flows, and would you be more of an advocate for recapturing and reusing the water?
Well, I'm an advocate for recapturing and using the water as long as it's clean.
And obviously, it's a total case-by-case situation, because you could have a construction zone where there's a ton of water that needs to be dewatered. So obviously, it's case-by-case.
Yeah, and you have some areas where the rate of water movement in that alluvium is really high, so you can pull a lot of water out if you pump. And places where there are clay layers and maybe you're not getting as much. So unfortunately, we have a really heterogeneous surface geology here. I think that building these deep walls is going to redirect the flow and potentially cause backups behind rows, if there are in fact rows of deep walls like that. And that's going to be an issue, and I wonder who will be responsible to deal with that issue.
Thank you.
This is the last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, and I guess this will be a quick question, or not so quick. So you mentioned about seismic, sort of the trade-off of, not having that much knowledge about the seismic effects of, let's say, building out on pontoons and things like that. So I'm just wondering if countries like Japan, if you're aware of any experimentation they've been doing, because they get a lot of earthquakes.
Yes, and they have a really cool thing. I love to say the name of it. It is a super dike.
Okay.
they have built these super dikes along rivers where flooding occurs because when you build a really wide dike or levee with terraces on the backside, you can actually build high-rises on top of it and roads and put pipes in it. It's like a topographic ridge at that point. And their earthquakes have proven that those super dikes are stable. So that's a reasonable thing for us to do if we have the right material. We have to have the right size of building material, gravels and sands, to make those geotechnically stable. And I hope that we'll build some super dikes in this area. But the problem with it is, if you're doing it along a river, it kind of makes sense. If you do it at the edge of the bay, you still have water piling up behind it. So we still have the groundwater backing up and the tributaries backing up. So we have to figure out how to do it. The Japanese have pioneered that, and they've done a fantastic job showing that they work in earthquakes.
You're saying this might be actually more appropriate for things like along our urban creeks and streams as opposed to, let's say, by the bay?
I don't know. It's a really interesting question, but the hard knot to untie is what to do where a creek comes to the bay. Because you can't put a wall to cut off the creek. So that's the hardest spot, and I think that's where the pond strategies may actually work. Super dikes probably work better where there isn't a tributary coming to the creek. And you have to have a lot of material, and I don't know where it comes from. So.
Professor Hill, can you stay around and take questions? So I think what we'll do is try to.
It's a very general question. Everybody would be interested here.
All right. Okay. Last question.
Major topic we've had in this auditorium other times have been putting train tracks in a trench underneath where the train is currently running now. But nobody has talked too much about the water table. I've talked about putting the creeks running under it, but I think the impact on the water table or the impact when the sea level rises enough may be a major issue in that, which we haven't heard too much about.
Well, whenever we build a tunnel underwater, we have to engineer it for the pressures of the underwater situation and seal it so it won't leak. So we do that. Even we in the United States do that. So I think we can build something that's in the water table, but it has to be stable in different ways, and it has to be sealed and kept an eye on and maintained. So if we're not willing to do that, we probably should not build the project. And yeah, and you might actually advocate for it to be deeper so that the water can pass over it. We were, in the Oakland project, we were looking at 880 and talking about putting 880 in a tunnel so that the tributaries could flow over the highway. And then future generations don't have to worry about, if we put it on a bridge or a causeway, did we put it high enough? Because it'll be so awful 30, 40, 50 years from now if we didn't build it high enough. They'll have to rip it out and rebuild it. Well, they're probably still paying for the one that we built. So we have to really look at the life cycles and how water is going to be moving when we make these investments. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you again, Dr. Hill, for your great talk. I would like to thank the many volunteers who weren't named, who helped put this event together. In particular, I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution that Julie Weiss from the city made in terms of organizing the scripting the evening and making sure that everything, all the details got properly taken care of. This presentation was videotaped, and there will be a link from Save Palo Alto's Groundwater's website. It'll probably go up tomorrow, and you'll also get an email tomorrow that will have the link, so if you want your friends, neighbors to listen to it, you can see it there. It was videotaped by Murray here of Zeta Productions as a courtesy. So that's it for people who'd like to talk with Dr. Hill. She'll be here for another 15, 20 minutes or so. We'll start cleaning up the room, so don't mind.